This morning we have one of our members and founders, Lucy Lewis, who's going to speak with us, and her presentation is the National Home for Destitute Women and Children. Lucy is an experienced freelance technical and creative writer. She's passionate about writing and its value in building understanding, and she's a storyteller. She's also an educator at heart. Lucy believes writing is an incredibly powerful educational tool, and that education is a lifelong journey. She's the owner and founder of Creative Futures, LLC, providing diverse writing services to her clients. Lucy draws on her diverse background, which includes 22 years experience in education, to develop her strong analytical and research skills that allow her to explore challenging topics and forge new understanding. She's applied that skill to research topics as disparate as theological concepts explored in her 2018 Oggs International Book Award winning book title, which is I Am Revival from Within the Garden. And the historical backdrop is from her genealogical research is also where she's applied these skills. Lucy holds a Master's in Education from William Howard Taft University, and her major was in educational leadership. She also has an MA in Human Services Administration from Springfield College and a BS in Elementary Education from American International College. Lucy's been published in the Afro-American Point of View community newspaper, the Executive Forum magazine, the Western Mass Women's Magazine, and UnityFirst.com. And with that, I'd like to bring her forward and have her give us her presentation.
Good morning. I never know who that strange woman is that they describe in that thing. So she's not coming, I'm coming instead. So here we go. Good morning. I am Dr. Lucy Lewis, and before we start my presentation, ladies and gentlemen, it's quiz time. I'm a mean person. Who can tell me the name of my presentation? Concentration. Do you remember? Do, 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 do. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Okay, what is it?
It's learning from others. Back where we learn as from people before us, and that's how we get where we're going.
Looking back. The African symbol of Santapa, looking backwards to move forwards. We're learning from the people on whose shoulders we stand. And that's the purpose of today's presentation. We spend an awful lot of time talking about the big things. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had a big enough mouth so people could hear me without it. But I'll behave and I'll try to use this. If you can't hear me, just let me know. So we're going to talk about little things. The little things that people don't think about, that they overlook, that they never hear about, but that make a huge difference in the lives that came before us that allow us to come forward. So we're going to begin our journey. If this thing doesn't play nice, I'll call my assistant back. So this is me, and she told you about my book and my journey and the things I've done, so you don't need to know any more about me. Except I like to tell stories. And this today, for me, is a story. And I'm going to tell you how this story started. This is my why. This is my why. This little character with his pleading hands is my why. This is my great-grandmother, Florence Virginia Jenkins Slate. My grandmother, Edith Cromwell, and my mother, Meta Postel Thomas. I knew them. Michael never met Graham. She was gone long before he got here. But he knew Edie. He wasn't quite yet 3 when Edie died. My mother and I had quite a debate
over whether Michael should go to Edie's funeral, because he and Edie was his heart. She was his world. And when she died, my mother said, no, he's too young to go to her funeral. It will scar him for life. You can bring him to the house after the funeral, but he cannot go to the funeral. And I said, he's not going to understand. He said, that's the deal. So we left him with my mother-in-law, and we went to the funeral. On the way home from the funeral, we swung by my mother-in-law's house, and we picked up the boy. And we took him to Edie's house like we'd always done. And he went upstairs and he couldn't find Edie. And he went in the kitchen and he couldn't find Edie. And he walked around the house and he couldn't find Edie. So on the stairs, and he wouldn't move. I said, Michael, why are you sitting on the stairs? He said, I'm waiting for Edie to come down. I have to see my friend. And my heart broke. I said, what am I supposed to say to him? He came here like everything was normal. And it's not. And he wasn't allowed to be part of what allowed it not to be normal. So I went and got the little Marine midget that, if you knew my mom, she was 2.5 feet tall and 9 feet of mouth. No, that's not nice, is it? No. But anyway, I went and got her, the little Marine sergeant, and I said, Mita, you're gonna have to talk to him. I cannot get Michael off the stairs. He's waiting for Edie to come down the stairs. And she ain't coming. So she went and talked to Michael, and they were out there forever. And finally, she got him off the stairs to get him to go get something to eat. We never spoke of it again. So, oops, be nice. So, he started my why. And then, that same little pesky person, now, you know how children, you love children, right? And you love to see them happy and smiling and full of mischief, and that was Michael. He was a bundle of let's get into trouble today and answer for it tomorrow. Well, one day he was coming home from school, and how many of you remember Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh? With the cloud over his head, Eeyore? And that was this little kid coming down the street. It was Eeyore transformed. And I could see the tears welding up inside this kid from all the way down the block. And as he walked up to the door, I said, Michael, what's the matter? I have a homework assignment due and I'm gonna flunk. I said, Michael, how do you know you're gonna flunk if you haven't started it? I have to build a family tree, and I don't have a family. Yeah, okay. Moms? Again? Yeah. And I sat there, and I made him a promise. I said, Michael, you got 2 living grandmothers. We will go, and we will cajole, we will pull, we will push, and we will do whatever we need to for them to at least tell us enough for you to get through this homework assignment. So we did. We went to see Mita, and we went to see Grandma Fanny, which is Jimmy's mother. And I know you can't read it, because it's 1,000 years old now, but this is his family tree. And the one thing I want you to see is this grave right here. He had the biggest tree in the class, and he was a very happy person. I said, Michael, there's too many holes in your tree. We are going to fill in those holes. I don't know how, but we're going to fill in those holes. And that started my genealogical research. The promise to a very heartbroken kid that needed to know where he came from. And so I started with the person I knew. I started with Graham. But there was a problem. There was a story that my grandma Edie told me several times. Florence, Virginia, was adopted in Boston because her parents were killed in the Civil War. And she was orphaned. Leona, did you ever hear that story?
From you.
Oh, for me. Edie never told. Maybe that was Edie's way to get rid of me. I don't know, because that was Edie's story to me. Maybe I was just a pesky kid that wouldn't go away.
You lived closer to him.
Huh?
You lived closer to her.
There you go.
Proximity.
So she was more able to tell me family myth and folklore. And so that was the story I was going to begin looking for. And I was going to try to find out more about how she came to be orphaned and what I could learn about her in the Civil War. I went to her obituary, and Margaret Bushfan was the daughter of the family who adopted her, so that gave validity to the story that something had happened in this child's life and some other family raised her. So I was very pleased with that little tale, and then we ended up with a problem. Did you notice the date on the obituary? My hubby's birthday.
What was that, 1900?
1960. Graham died March 7th, 1960. See, if you were my fourth graders, I would make you answer this question before I went to the slide. But I've already given you one test today, so I'm going to be nice. The Civil War ended in 1865. Graham was 87 when she died. Now, I never passed a math class in my life. I struggled to add 2 and 2 and not get 12. But somehow or another, even the calculator couldn't make this come out to being orphaned in the Civil War. Try as I might, I couldn't make that truth happen. And this question bothered me. It had bothered me for a while, because Graham just didn't seem old enough when I met her. She was older than dirt, but she wasn't old enough to have been in the Civil War. That was too long ago. So I had to start figuring this out. And that's where my personal journey began. And that's what landed me in a very strange place. I looked at the census, and the 1880 census, she's there. And she's 7. Gives me a very different birthday than before the Civil War began. She clearly was not orphaned in the Civil War. But there's something over here, something peculiar and strange, written for this cluster of people that I couldn't make sense of. And when I put it under the magnifier, it came up, the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children. That's where Graham lived in 1880. So she really was orphaned. She really did live in an orphanage. And I found the 1880 DDD, and it confirmed that she had been put in an orphanage in 1879. What broke my heart, and I've struggled to try to read those numbers, I can't tell if it's December 24th or December 29th, because it's smudged. In my mind, I refuse to accept that Graham got surrendered to an orphanage the day before Christmas. The day before, just before New Year's, okay, fine, but not the day before Christmas. My mind refuses to accept that. So I made that a 29 in my mind. But nonetheless, the end of December 1979, Graham did get surrendered to a place called the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children. So there was a kernel of truth hiding in Edie's story. She was in an orphanage in the District of Columbia where she was born. So that began the question of how. How did this happen? Let me understand this and figure out what this orphanage is.
So I began researching first what was going on in DC, and then what could have happened to Graham, and looking for census and looking for things to make sense. DC was a mess. It went bankrupt. Families were coming unglued. The level of destitution amongst the newly freed contraband that had flooded DC was overwhelming. So that's how Graham ended up in the condition she was in. DC was a mess. And whatever happened to her family, DC was a mess, and it impacted her and her brother. So, okay, DC was a mess. What is this place? Now, what is the first thing you think about when you look at this building? That's the first picture I found of the orphanage. Does anybody have any thoughts back to Oliver Twist?
And I had some more points.
This place terrified me. It's dark, it's dreary, it's
Huge.
nobody would live there. But that was an orphanage for a very long time. And that is the orphanage from which Graham came. The image of that house gave me nightmares, but I needed to know more. So I began doing research. And I'm going to read some of this. I don't usually have this many words on a slide, but this is important stuff, so I do. And here's a quote. The orphanage eventually became, how many of you are familiar with Washington, D.C. today? That you have heard of the Emergence Community Arts Collection, run by Sylvia Robinson? That is on 733 Euclid Avenue. That was the last address of the home, and she was able to work with the final people of record and turn it into an emergent art center for young people. So out of some place that wasn't for delight and joy, she's turned it into something for arts. And she's the first one I spoke with. And she did a historical retrospective on the building, and I was able to get a lot of information from her. But you think about the time, and this quote struck me. While great men debated, planned, and philosophized on the Negro problem, great women were quietly servicing the day-to-day needs of thousands of children left destitute in the city. They found shelter, they found clothing, they found food, they found teachers, they found help. For the women who led this effort, there was nothing to debate. There was just work to do. It's a very important perspective when we think about the messages we give to our young people. We do all the accolades and highlights and star shining on the big stuff, the big people, the upfront people. We forget all the people in the background that made something happen. And so this story is about the women in the background who were day to day making something happen. So in 1863, there was an association called the National Association for the Relief of Destitute Colored Women and Children. And their purpose was to support the aged and indigent colored women and children, so they could be taken charge of, that they could get help, that they could be clothed and housed and have a proper Christian influence for what they needed. 1863. This was before the end of the Civil War, because the contraband, as they were called, flooded DC long before the Civil War ended, putting financial pressures on the city that they could not support, putting people in destitute conditions that they could not help. So this actually started before the end of the Civil War. This statement bothered me. The society may receive into a house, a building, any destitute child or children at the request of the parents or guardian or next friend
or the mother if the father be dead or has abandoned his family. That doesn't say mom and dad have to have kicked the bucket. It just has to say they can't handle the kids. So when I use the word surrendered, there's a reason that I use the word surrendered, because that's what families did. Even if the parents were still living, even if the father was living but he was a drunkard or unable to care for his family, the mother could surrender those children, give them away, to be taken care of by somebody else. Surrender their parental rights. Was Graham surrendered, or was she orphaned? That's a story for later. They call... Quiet. That took care of that. I thought that was off. It's his fault. He made me forget. I'm gonna blame him.
As usual.
I paid for the right to blame him. So, as I looked further into the information on the home, there's another word that bothered me intensely. They called them inmates. Inmates. Not charges, not children. They called them inmates. And they were going to make sure they had a proper moral foundation. These little precious inmates in this home to which they were surrendered. Yeah. Your face says everything right there. These children were prepared through a curriculum for maths, English, basic literate skills to be able to function. But mostly they were prepared for industriousness. So they were taught domestic skills, carpentry skills, farming skills, so they could go out and be useful individuals in the pursuit of a decent Christian life. And when they were of age, if they were not requested before, they were indentured out on a contract. If they were older than 8 years old, they were indentured out on a contract. So, was Graham adopted or was she indentured? And that's another question that needed to come later. At age 12 or sooner. So they couldn't stay in the house very long. Now, Graham was surrendered in 1879 at 7. Her brother Tom was 2 years older than her. He was 9. They only had a few years that they could stay in that house to learn the skills they needed and to be ready to be indentured elsewhere. When you think of the work that this home did. Now, this is hard to read, so I will read it for you, because it might be hard to read from the back. At age 12 or sooner, if requested, the association will seek homes for the children in an indentured service agreement. The foster home would receive a child trained in household work, carpentry, or as a farmhand. In exchange, the home would be required to continue their instruction, treat them well, and prepare them for life. Given the racial sentiment of the time, many homes were interested only in the prospect of free labor. The association had a very difficult task of following up on the status of the children placed in foster homes to make sure they were being treated in accordance with their contracts. This was a very labor-intensive, particularly since children were distributed nationally, placed in New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Foster homes could request particular ages from the association, and children were usually adopted between the ages of 4 and 8. So that means Graham had 1 year to stay in the house if she was going to be adopted. She went in at 7. After 8, she was indentured, not foster. So the important thing about the organization is we were part of it. We don't think about how the role we played. So much of the history of the African American experience is with the rescuer that comes in and swoops down and makes everything right and puts everything the way it needs to be. And without their hand and their help, we would be helpless. So I think it's important to understand, maybe it didn't happen on day 1. Maybe it didn't happen in year 1. But it's important to understand we were part of our own solution of making sure our children were cared for. And that's the message we need to be making sure we pass on. The African American people are not a helpless, hopeless people. Well, some of us are, but we won't go there. But that's a different reason. We have always worked to find a way to be part of our own destination. And the home was no different. When it was organized, yes, it took people of power, it took people of influence, it took people of money and position to get it started. You're not going to be a destitute, freed slave on the street corner and get someone to start a home for you. You need that partnership, you need that cooperation, you need that collaboration for someone to speak up with a voice. But then, to step up and be part of what was created, for me, is an important message of the home. And that's what happened. In 1872, it gained black trustees. From the very beginning, it had black donors, black people involved in trying to make a difference. Some of the original faculty were trained black women that went in and became part of the faculty. So, I can read this if you'd like. The association operated by committee made up of executive officers and a board of managers. All officers and committee members served without compensation. There were no salaried officers except the superintendent and matron. All other employees received wages not exceeding $15 per month. Physicians were brought in for constant medical attention the children needed, usually for no fee. There were 3 trustees annually elected who assisted in the conduct of public business, and helped in the general management of the home. There were no black trustees for 9 years. But in 1872, Dr. Charles D. Purvis and James Worley, noted proprietor of Wormley's Hotel, were elected. Frederick Douglass became a lifetime member in 1886 and was a trustee in 1879. We've all heard the name Frederick Douglass. How many of you have heard of Charles Purvis? How many of you have heard the name of James Wormley? These are names of people that stepped forward to make a difference in the lives of others, but we don't know anything about them. The collaboration of black and white activists in the cause of the colored home, it became called the colored home, was perhaps most vividly exemplified by the case of trustee Dr. Purvis and his wife Ann. Charles Burleigh Purvis, son of abolitionist Robert Purvis and Harriet Fortran, served at the Contraband Hospital at Camp Baker during the Civil War. There's that word again, contraband. The runaway slaves, the freed slaves pouring into the city, they were called contraband. We've been called a lot of names, but being thought of as contraband broke my heart. We were contraband. In 1865, he joined the Army as an acting assistant surgeon and continued to serve in that capacity until 1869. He was the first black physician to head a hospital under civilian authority when he was made surgeon in charge of Freedmen's Hospital in 1881 and became president of the medical school faculty at Howard University in 1889. We should know about him. Our kids should know about him. Again, this comment from the home. In 1869, reference to the founding by black Washingtonians of the Colored Orphaned Age Society was a harbinger of transition. So by 1869, there were already black people actively engaged in the National Association for the Relief of Colored People, the Colored Orphaned Age Society, and the churches to find solutions, homes, protection, care, for people in desperate need. In 1869, Mrs. Stella Martin, born Sarah Ann Lattimore, the wife of John Stella Martin, a noted black abolitionist, was one of the 9 managers of the home. By 1872 and 1879, the National Colored Home acquired its first black trustees. Frederick Douglass was the federal marshal for the District of Columbia in Washington in 1877. Washington Hotel James and Dr. Charles Purvis. By 1885, at least 2 women of color sat on the board of managers. Charlotte Grimke, born Charlotte Fortran Purvis, and Mary Robinson Merriweather. By 1892, it fell to Merriweather, an Oberlin graduate and teacher at a preparatory school for Negro youth, to address an appeal to Congress to continue its support of the colored home. She became president of the association in 1915. We were there. We were part of the home. So this is just his bio, and I'm not going to read that unless you want me to. But he was a very impressive man, Dr. Charles Purvis, and he did a lot of work with Worcester Medical College, Harvard, Freedman Hospital in Washington, D.C. This is a man who we don't talk about, who was a name that we should be applauding, who came to be a trustee of the National Home of Destitute Colored Women and Children. Here's the membership list for 1883. And you can see. My question was always, how did Graham get from D.C. to Cambridge? That did not seem like a natural transition to me until I found the membership, the board of directors. And I learned that St. Paul's AME Church was a vital part for helping to place these children. Jeremiah and Hannah Slater were among the founding members of St. Paul's AME Church. The church's connection to the home, because of the members on the board of directors, were helpful and instrumental in helping to place out those children in this area. Graham got to Cambridge because of St. Paul's AME Church, right here in Cambridge. Let's see. Some of these names stand out, like the Peabody name, but some of those names, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Putnam, Well, you may never have heard those names. They're just average people trying to make a difference. So that's how Graham ended up. St. Paul's AME Church, Jeremiah and Hannah Slater are listed as founders, and St. Paul was part of that process. So we know where Graham ended up, but she was surrendered with a brother. And Thomas, I'm not a farmer. I don't know where things grow, so I still struggle with where this letter is trying to tell me he was. But Mrs. Heacock was one of the favorite teachers down at the school. And this young lady wrote a letter back to the school after she had gotten out in 1884. And in her letter, she told her she saw Thomas Jenkins just down the road the other day. Now, I don't know, does anybody know where those things grow? According to my little Aunt Dolly, there was a Virginia, of course, she lied too. It was a terrible thing. But she said that there was a Virginia connection, that Graham had a Virginia connection. And so I've been trying to study what grew in Virginia, in the Virginia farms. I don't know if this stuff was in Virginia or if he got indentured somewhere else. But the one thing I do know is they went in 1879, and by 1883 they were no longer there. I also know that Meg Bushfan was born in 1881, and that Graham was most likely brought to Massachusetts by the Slaters to help them care for the baby, which means she would have been brought to Massachusetts somewhere around 82, maybe as early as 81, but possibly 82. She was born in 73. If I do the math to when Meg Bushfan was born, and her name was Slater, Margaret Slater Bushfan.
I'm sorry, what was that again?
Margaret Slater Bushfan
Thank you.
was the daughter of the family that adopted Graham. But did they adopt her? If she wasn't born until 1881, Graham was already 9. After 8 years old, they were indentured out, not adopted out, not fostered out. So an indentured contract for the purpose of performing some family duty or obligation. So when I called the state of Massachusetts to see what adoption records there could be, what foster records there could be back that far, they explained there probably wouldn't be any. It was between the church and the home, probably never went through the state, because it was not a legal adoption in that sense where they became her parents. It was a working contract. So wherever Tom went, he was already over 8 when he went into the home. He could only stay for another 3 years, so we know he was definitely gone by 82. In my mind, the thought of them being separated is just too incredible. So I've always envisioned that they got placed out at the same time so that they were never alone in that scary little house. But my imagination goes some wonderful places, so that's my story and I'm sticking to it. But I suspect that Graham and her brother Tom were indentured out of the home no later than 1882. They are not listed in the 1883 records, which is the first annual report I could find after 1878. I found the 1878 and the 1883, but the ones in the middle are missing. And the Board of Charities in DC does not know where they are, and I continue to look for them. Somebody has them in their attic. So, sweet potatoes, cabbage, watermelons, where do they grow? Do they grow in Virginia? Is Dolly right? Could he have been in Virginia?
Yes.
They do grow. Okay, so we'll give Dolly a thumbs up.
We'll say Dolly's probably right. He got indentured to Virginia. Even though I can't find him on the census, he may not have stayed long. But I know after Graham's husband died, he came to Massachusetts to be with her. And he went to St. Paul's AME Church. And he was an associate minister of some kind at the church. And he died in Massachusetts in 1923. So they did get back together again by the end. The question is, what happened to them? So, when I got his death certificate, there was a name for a father. The mother's name wasn't there, but the father's name was, because Thomas was apparently a junior. So I scoured back in the day when you had to use microfiche and actually go to the archives and sit and do microfiche. The little guy came with me. He would go pull the rolls for me, and he would sit and help me rewind them. And we would sit up in Pittsfield going through these archival records and the little orange paper so you could see what was there. And we went through as many rolls of DC over and over and over again, looking for a black Thomas Jenkins. I found several Thomas Jenkins, but they were all white. I found one black Thomas Jenkins. Now either the family did die, or the family became so destitute that they could not keep these children. So what could have happened that made this home necessary? Conjecture, working on it, but conjecture yet still. I found an 1870 record for this Thomas Jenkins and his wife, and they had one son, William. He was born in 1869. So that was on the 1870 census. By the 1880 census, I knew that Graham and Tom were already in the orphanage. But there was an 1880 census for this Thomas, his wife, Rachel, and their son, William. But by 1880, they had 3 other children. One of them was a newborn. Now, on the 1870 census, they were living with a family named Lee. They had several little children. When you look at the 1880 census for the home, there's 2 children with very similar names of Lee children that were quite ill. The woman that was living with them is now a laundress at the home. Her husband died. Was the family being together in that way what allowed them to survive? And when the husband died, was he the father? Was he the brother? Was he a brother-in-law? The 1870 census doesn't tell you. But there's also a Thomas Jenkins' brother, Meredith Jenkins, living in the home. By 1880, Meredith is gone. He's still somewhere in DC, but he's no longer with them. They're all split up. The 2 little Lee girls are in the home. The mom is the laundress for the home. The Jenkins family is off in another section of DC with not just a couple of kids, they got baby kids. So they had one in 75, they had another one in 77, and they had one in 78 or early 79. One of the babies was named Charlie. So I had this conversation with my Aunt Helen. These aunts are pesky, terrible people. I had this conversation with Helen about this maybe family, about what happened that Graham was surrendered to this home. And she said, I spent a lot of time talking to Graham. She said, she always talked about her baby brother Charlie.
I said, well, Charlie's the youngest baby in the household that was born just shortly before, they would have been surrendered. She said, I'm thinking you got the right family because Graham always talked about missing her baby brother Charlie. So I don't know if I found the right family or not, but I think the connecting family, the older husband died, Rachel kept having babies, and with just the one of them, Thomas, trying to make this family work, and now 6 kids in the household. William was old enough to go to work. The other babies were too young to go to the home because at that point they had a cutoff. You had to be a certain age. The only 2 that were the right age were Graham and Tom. She gave away her 2 babies so she could let her family survive. And in 1990, she gives account of how many children she had and how many were still living. And it's a difference of 2. Now, did she have 2 babies that died? And I'm just making up the story in my crazy little head? Or did she consider surrendering the rights to those children, a death of those children, that she would never see them again? I have Rachel's death certificate. I know when she died. William, I can't find him after the 1900 census. And unfortunately, the children's names are so common that you can find William Jenkins and you can find John Jenkins, and they did not give their children unusual enough names for me to trace them and see what happened. But without the national home for destitute colored women and children, would this family have survived? Would there have been an 1880 record for them? Would there have been a 1900 record for them? Without the home and a place to surrender those 2 babies, what would have happened to this family? I've adopted them. I went to a conference once and I was telling this story and I said, I don't know about this family. It's a maybe family. And one woman there who'd been doing genealogy way longer than I did put her arm around me and she said, listen, when you've got that much of a maybe, you make it a yes. You adopt this family and you research this family as if they are yours until you get proof that they're not. So that's what I've been doing, is trying to find DNA matches to this Jenkins surname to see if I could prove that this is Graham's family. I have several Jenkins matches, but they don't go back far enough for us to connect because I can't confirm the names that I'm looking. Rachel Waters, I have a ton of DNA matches that are Waters. And I'm saying, is this a family? Are these my people? I don't know yet. It's still a story yet to be told. But they were definitely orphaned. No, they were surrendered. And they were indentured out to become useful in some industrious way in the world. Ironically, Hannah Slater was actually a Langford from Nova Scotia. And when her cousin, Joseph Cromwell, came from Nova Scotia to Boston, all them Boston Cromwells connected, Joseph Cromwell, Hannah Slater's first cousin, married Florence Virginia Jenkins. So she may not have been adopted, but she definitely became part of the family because she was a Cromwell after all. So I was most relieved, if you remember that picture, that terrible, terrible picture. They didn't move into that house until 1886. The brick house that they talk about getting built in 1886. So here's the story about the home. A very, very sad story. When the home was begun in 1863, we were at war.
Now, some people in 1863 sided with the North from Washington. Some people sided with the South. A gentleman by the name of Mr. Richard Cox, who was a government employee at the time, sided with the South. And he walked away from his post, he walked away from his home, and he went down and he joined the Confederate forces. So, under the Confiscation Act, they took his house. And so they moved the home into this wonderful confiscated house. Except when the South lost the war, Mr. Cox decided, oh, I was so wrong. I need my house back. I need to go home and start my life again because we lost. How sad. And he went to petition for a pardon and his home. And there was a huge battle, legal battle, all kinds of battles. People on both sides. Oh, he should be pardoned. Oh, no, he shouldn't be pardoned. You're going to throw us out of this house. What about all these poor little babies? We got 64 babies living in this house. What are we going to do with them if you throw us out? This battle went on for a couple of years, at least a year, maybe a little more. But in 1866, they decided they would pardon dear Mr. Cox. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau said, this is terrible. We have to give these people a home. So we have a home that we will move them into on 8th Street. But the home needs repair. It needs renovation and restoration so that these children will have a safe place to live. Mr. Cox, will you please be patient enough to give us time until October to move these babies into their new home? Yeah, okay, yeah, right. I'm going to be nice to you. Why? You just pardoned me for all my sins and you took my house and now I want it back. So he snuck in the middle of the night and he took out all the windows and he did other horrible, terrible stuff and he made the house unlivable. Then he stole their food and put them out. So the Freedmen's Bureau went and got them and moved them into a not yet finished home. So the conditions were not quite ideal for them to live in. By stealing their food that they had grown during the summer, he did this in October. They're not going to be able to grow more food for a year. So they were very dependent on donations and the kindness of others to get these kids through a winter in a house that was not yet sealed and ready for babies to live in during the winter. But dear Mr. Cox had his house back, and oh, by the way, he sued them for $1,000 because they'd made $3,000 worth of improvements to his home that he disapproved of and he thought were destructive. And by the way, he took all the windows out and that was damaged, so he could sue them because the windows came out and it was their fault. And so he sued them. The good news is he lost that lawsuit. He didn't get his $1,000, but he didn't have to give the food back. And so they moved into this house in 1866. And they stayed there until 1885, when this house could no longer be made livable for people. The plumbing was horrible. There were all kinds of issues and problems with this home. But this is where they lived. This is actually the house that Graham went into. This is the house that Graham lived in from 1879 to whatever 1880, prior to 1883, that she lived in. I felt much better after looking at this house. But they raised those children in that home on less than 50 cents a day. I don't know what that translates to in today's money, but 50 cents a day doesn't come up to a whole lot of dollars. Somebody far better in math and inflation and future value, we're going to have to calculate that out for me because I didn't get that part of math either. But they had upwards of 60 children and indigent adults in this home, and they cared for them at 50 cents a day. They made their own clothes, they grew their own food, the kids learned skills, became part of the solution for sustaining the home in the things that they did and the work that they were able to do.
They did, in fact, take children with little or no hope because their families were destitute. Some of them were living in tents, or if they were living in not tents, out in some kind of the descriptions they give of the neighborhoods that these people were forced to live in because they had nothing was beyond deplorable. They had a clean, safe place because of the vision of a few women that believed something can be done for the Negro problem without philosophizing and strategizing. We're going to do something. We're going to put forward our hand, and we're going to do something to make the lives of these children better. These are pictures of the women that were instrumental in helping the home. Elizabeth Hobbs Cakeley, she was among the first members of the board, among the first people that got this started. You may have heard her name before. She was the seamstress for Mrs. Todd Lincoln. In fact, Mrs. Todd Lincoln gave her some money to help in her investment in the home. The irony of Elizabeth Hobbs Cakeley is she died in the home. So the home she helped to start was the home that helped preserve her in her dying days. Josephine Beale Bruce, Rebecca J. Cole. Rebecca J. Cole became one of the matrons of the home. For many years, she was a matron. She graduated from the Institute for Colored Youth and received a medical degree from the Women's Medical College in 1867. She became a matron for the home. Helen Abko Cook and Charlotte L. Fortran Grimke. These are names that we should applaud. These are women that took a stand to make sure that the lives of our babies had a chance for a better tomorrow. We don't celebrate these silent heroes. We don't applaud the home. We don't talk about the home. Nobody. I called Schoenberg to get information on the home, and they said, "Who?" I said, "You're Schoenberg." "Yeah, we've never heard of it." The National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children. It's a name we should speak of, because it's a name that saved the lives of many by the hands of us. These are some of the sources that I used. So am I fine? We have to go put money in the whoozy thing. You. You have to go put money in the whoozy thing too. So, do you have any questions? I don't want to hold things up, and I know I'm the only thing between you and lunch, but...
Is that home still in existence, or some variation of it?
The physical property is still there. What happened to the home itself is it, in 1927, it became the Meredith home, where she then took responsibility for it, but the association retained ownership of the property. When they could no longer sustain the home was closed down, and the property remained vacant until the Emergence Art Collective opened it, because they moved. Okay. Back in the 1920s, that horrible, scary, ugly place became so unlivable that the District of Columbia said, this is not a habitable house. It is dark and despicable. And so they moved them from there to 733 Euclid Avenue. They were able to buy 733 Euclid Avenue because somebody gave them the property for like a couple of bucks.
Well, no, initially, when the government said we have to have a home for the...
Contraband, the destitute children, yes.
Did it designate funds to support this?
Yes, the home was supported by the government every year.
Not a lot, except in 1865, they gave them $18,000 to build the new home on 8th Street, the brick home on Blair House, ugly, scary house. So they gave them $18,000 to build that, but every year, a central part of the budget for the home was several $1,000s a year from the government to sustain them. So yes, Congress did put its money where its mouth was to make sure the home could stay open. It was never enough. 50 cents a day is not a lot of money, but they did affiliate them with a hospital that Dr. Purvis was part of to make sure that they had medical care and attention. So they did do some serious and respectable and intentional things to care for these young children that couldn't care for themselves. And they did sustain it well up into the 1920s before it finally had to close. It became the Meredith House, and it was that for many years. And I wrote those dates down so I'd remember to tell them to you, and I can pull them out if you want. I forgot, but they did. Any other questions?
I didn't know how interesting this talk was going to be. I was debating coming, and
Well, thank you for coming.
how interesting this can be. And,
We clean that up, please.
He's a guy.
My great-great-grandmother was born in St. George, Maine.
Okay.
She was one of 4 children, and her dad, her mom died, and very similar to the story. She was one of 4 kids. The dad could not raise this family, so we believe that he turned them over, or bound them out, to families, different families on the Great Cranberry Isle, which is an island off the coast of Maine. Mm-hmm. And my great-great-grandmother came to Boston sometime in the mid-1860s. She was born in 1847. Mm-hmm. So it's a very relatable story. And two, the center of the family is in Cambridge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
we do have a connection with Cromwell's.
There you go.
Yeah.
That, as sad as that story is, it happened in more families than we like to talk about. Think about it. They had, they were having 64 to 100 kids year after year after year, and they could only stay but so long. So imagine all of their years of service that they were in, because they started in 63, they didn't close till sometime in the 20s. By the time they were down toward the end, they were closer to 10, 15, 20 kids. But well up until or after the 1900s, which is over 40 plus years, they were servicing that level of kids. And the expectation that they're coming from families without the wherewithal and the ability to raise their children. So somebody is saying, take my child, I can't do this anymore. Unlike, you lose both your parents, you go somewhere, you deal with it. But the idea of knowing your family is continuing without you, that's why I say I have to have that date December 29th. I cannot let that date be December 24th. You cannot give away my great-grandmother the day before Christmas and have her know that her big brother and her baby brothers and sisters are all going to stay there for Christmas dinner. And I keep saying, well, maybe Christmas wasn't a big deal. But there are a lot of families that share that story and share the pain of that story. And I think that's a lot of the reason that Graham was so quiet about her life, because she did have that, she was old enough to have had that memory that she was walked out of the home. I wrote a short story that I'm not ready to do anything with about what it would have been like that day. How could she have gotten them to leave? What would it have been? What would have been, okay, so we're gonna go get ice cream down at the corner, but it's not the corner we usually go to. We're gonna walk through the park, and we're gonna go and we're gonna get ice cream there. So why don't you, I make up in my head, how do you take your kid? It's bad enough to take your puppy to the vet and leave him for the kennel when you have to leave town. How do you take your kid and know you're gonna leave them? And how does that kid know mommy just walked away and she's not coming back? My mind can't let that day go. And now that I have a date, it's even more vivid in my mind as to what that day must have been like. So yeah, that's a common story.
I like the way you continue to keep questioning yourself, keep asking questions, even though you discover something that could be a fact, you would do more research and make sure, and just kept asking question after question. I like that.
Well, thank you. I was too stubborn to stop. That drove my mother crazy, but it serves me well now. Any other questions?
Just interestingly, how long did it take you to get to the point that you're at now with this story? Like how many years?
Let me see. My son was in what, 4th or 5th grade?
Yeah, about 4th.
4th or 5th grade. And I've been working ever since. We found the home somewhere in the first 4 or 5 years we found the home. And running into brick walls ever since, and continuing to try to learn about the home and get past the brick walls and figure it out. So you just have to, I figure it took me over 20 years to find my father's father, so I still have time. It's only been 20 years that I've been looking for Graham's mother. So it's just a question of patience, stubbornness, and endurance to find answers to the missing holes in your tree.
Yeah, I think I heard you present, was it in Springfield?
Yeah.
Since then, I don't remember how long ago that was. It was quite a while ago.
Yeah, it was.
But I see how you filled in everything so much. You didn't have all this
I
information
didn't have all
at
that,
that
no.
time. So let me compliment you. Okay, so that's one book. I'd suggest another book.
Okay.
And that will be to examine the character of Graham. You know, a lot of people have formal ways they address their elders. In our family, it's been mostly by the first name.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if people understand. Edie is our grandmother. Graham or Floss is
Graham
our
is Floss.
great-grandmother. That kind of thing. But the little lady, Graham, 4 foot nothing. I've kind of, through my DNA, I'm thinking they may have been, what do they call those little people?
Pygmy. The little pygmy. The pygmy, yeah.
Pygmies.
Yep.
And there's a tribal name.
Yep.
You know? And the men, Graham's sons, are short as she is. They're all
Yep.
little people.
Yep.
And but I think there's a lot to examine about her as a character. In spite of what she came up through, she had a sense of humor about her. And I think if you talk in the family, you'll probably find some very humorous stories.
Yeah, and I do need to capture that oral history, because Helen told me that she was a midwife that delivered all of Edie's children, and I didn't know that.
Holy cow. I just said holy cow.
Yeah, that's on Helen's story, and she's sticking to it.
Well,
The thing that I remember most about Graham, yes, she was 2.5 feet. My mother might have been 3. I mean, they were little guys. But anyway, we kids, her great-grandchildren would all be running around, and she would give us nickels and dimes and whatever, or quarters or whatever. And my mother would come in the room, and she would take out 2 pennies, and she would give them to my mother. And she'd say, "I'm giving you the pennies because you're the littlest." It was like, okay, you can't do that. But Graham she was hysterical. And she used to sit and she used to watch the birds through the window. But given what she came up through, she did have a presence about her that was softer than you would expect, and funnier than you would expect.
Can I tell you one thing? Charlie and I have been married for a very long time.
All my life.
But what we did was we had the wedding party up in Springfield, and Graham was there. And a man came up, one of the ushers, the whole wedding party was there. One of the ushers came up and asked her to dance. And she said, "I saw you out there shaking it to the winds with all those hussies. You'll never shake it to the winds with me." That's the kind of person she was.
She was a trip. She was a trip. So I thank you so much for your attention and your time. And I hope you